We do.
Okay, good. Hello, everyone. I'm from Siberia with Love to present our paper we've been working on for some years. And the title is Do Dark Needle Forests Decline in the Southern Siberian Mountains? My co-authors, Yelena Bajina, Yelena Parfyonova, Ember Soya, and Pasha Groisman. So the main point is that from the 70s of the previous century, scientists observed damage and decline of dark needle conifer forests in middle to high elevations in southern Siberian mountains. The damage was expressed by necrosis of branches with generative organs by the linear and radial increment decrease by chlorosis, necrosis, and premature needle folds, and by stem root in these dark leaf or needles. Sometimes I will use dark leaves, sometimes dark needle trees. So the mountains of southern Siberia are located in the Eurasian continent and stretches latitudinally for about 3,000 meters. The mountains are barriers for intercepting moisture-bearing air masses that create favorable conditions for growing water-loving tree species like Siberian pine, Pinus siberica, Siberian fir, and Siberian spruce, which are shade tolerant, and we name them in Russian geobotanical classifications like dark conifers. I already said about this, and there are several hypotheses to which trying to explain about this decline or damage of this dark needle species. Uh, so there are um, 4 or 5 hypotheses. Abiotic primary reasons include climate change, specifically climatic drought, as cited in the local literature by Haruk, anthropogenic environmental pollution, or very recent hypotheses suggest that increased hard ultraviolet radiation caused by the tropospheric ozone depletion and additionally amplified by the increased ozone concentration in the near surface layer. Biotic secondary reasons associated with a pathogen and with invasive insects, pests, and they're considered by foresters and ecologists as post effect for already weakened trees by the primary reasons. Um, our goal of this study was to accept or reject one particular hypothesis. Is the climate drying across the southern Siberian mountains? And if the climate is drying, that may cause decline or dieback of darkleaf conifers at middle to high elevation belts as referred in the literature. I already cited this literature. Here, very shortly, I will show the area. This is southern Siberian mountains, and this is Russia and uh, forest map of Russia. This is mode of vegetation types, which are listed here, and we chose 8 here I show 9, but we chose 8 weather stations to calculate lapse rate along 4 uh, climatic profiles. This is Transbaikalia, this is Westsayan, Isayan, and Kuznetskaya Latau. I understand it's pretty difficult to understand Russian names, but it's 4 profiles where we work. Skip this one. So now I want to say a couple of words about methods. Damage was evaluated based on tree damage and step damage as following. Tree damage was calculated based on subepical damage evidence. Oops. It's here. I want to show this is a picture made in the field, and this is a sketch. So this is healthy tree. This is weak damage, then moderate damage, and severe damage. Then canopy damage vitality index was calculated as weighted average of all trees in the stand. Regarding climatic indices, we used 2 of them: annual moisture index, which is growing degree days about 5 degrees divided by annual precipitation, and another drought index by the Santa Serrano. This is SPEI, standardized precipitation evaporation index, which is based on climatic water balance, precipitation minus potential evapotranspiration, adjusted to a logistic probability of distribution. And SPEI defines 5 drought speed classes. It's written here: no drought, light drought, and so on, to severe and extreme drought. And here I showed annual moisture index. I want to show that for dark leaf conifers, which are located beneath this blue line, they never crossed this line, and this is a critical line which limits dark leaf conifers distribution, because this line 3.5 is the line which separates steppe vegetation and light meadow vegetation. Here I want to show that climatic water balance, which is precipitation minus potential evaporation, for dark conifers, which are marked blue, water balance is always positive. And this red water balance means only for forest steppe, which may be negative, always negative, not maybe, but is always negative. And here I want to show several pictures again. It's interesting that here extreme droughts evaluated by SPEI was found in these years, and severe canopy damage was found in 1991 and 1999, and only 1 year, 1999, coincide for both extreme drought and severe canopy damage. The same about East Siam, that only 1 year of extreme droughts and severe canopy damage coincide. West Siam 2 years we can see, and Transbaikalia Hamardaban range no matches at all of extreme droughts and severe canopy damage. So, do I have how much time I have? And
you have 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Okay, so I go to conclusions that observations of forest health across the southern Siberian mountains showed that the darkening of conifers decline take place at middle to high elevation on windward mountain slopes. Climate time series for the last 60 years demonstrated that at these elevations, moisture conditions have not changed much. Annual moisture index varied between 0.2 to 2.8. Maybe it's not here. Which means that moisture conditions were very wet. In the future, we also modeled the moisture conditions in dry climates by the end of the century and found that habitats at the middle to high elevation would remain sufficiently moist for dark needle, Pinus siberica and Abies siberica. Also, the principal conclusion is that based on moisture drought indices, we found that decline of dark conifers at middle to high elevations happened in most and extremmost years rather than in drought years. Thus, other weighty arguments rather than drought should be found to explain the decline dieback of dark conifer forest over the southern Siberian mountains. That's all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chebakova, for your presentation. So it looks like we're right on time we probably need to transition into our next speaker, who is Dr. Vaclav Keruk, also from the Russian Academy of Sciences. If anyone has questions, please, for Dr. Chebakova, please do type them into the chat window. Dr. Keruk, feel free. Oh, and Dr. Chebakova, if you could please stop sharing your screen.
Good night, dear colleagues. Do you see my presentation?
We do. Thank you.
Many thanks for opportunity to speak with our colleague from the America, China, and other countries. Here we consider conifer decline and mortality in the central Siberia.
Sorry, let me interrupt you for 1 second. Please, folks, if you're not presenting, please mute yourself. Thank you.
Because, okay. In this report, we consider the following aspects of the phenomenon. First, Siberian pine and fir decline in mortality in Siberia. Second one, Siberian pine and fir mortality caused by insect pest defoliators like Siberian moths and bug beetles. And third one, the Siberian pine and fir mortality versus climate variables. Study species, Siberian pine, you consider this majestic tree with height up to 30 meters, long-lived, and upper limit elevation limit more than 2,000 meters. Siberian fir is less lifespan, but both species are very precipitation sensitive and does not tolerate low air humidity. We call it the tree of fogs. And we use different methods for measurements on study measurements on site, in situ measurements, dendrochronology analysis, satellite data, soil moisture content, atmospheric drought and topography. And here, the study area. It actually included about 90 or even more % of the dark needle taiga composed by Siberian pine, fir, and also spruce. But this spruce do not consider here. And here our test site, but not all. This is oval is corresponding to catastrophic outbreak, which caused mortality about 1 million hectare. And here it is a cumulative mortality within that area. It is annual mortality of the area. And test mortality during last decades was about 2 million hectare. And here it is a region of the south of Siberia. We call it Altai Mountain region. And here we see the dependence of the tree mortality on the elevation. The most mortality located on the low elevation, whereas at the high elevation, say about 1,000 meters and more, the trees grows better and stands becomes dense and denser. Here on this map shown red, it's declining areas, green one, where the growth is decreasing, mostly high elevation areas. And here some relationship is with the topography. Most mortality observed on the south facing water stress danger slopes. And here this chart shows that most species depends on the root zone moisture content, on the thermal degrees days, and mortality are related with the also with the drought index. Then conifer mortality caused by insect pest outbreaks. Insect pests alongside these wildfires are the major factor of the Siberian taiga dynamics because of that. Insect outbreaks colloquially called green fire. And the major species which say enemies for Siberian taiga, first one, Siberian moth, defoliate fir, Siberian pine, also large species, and bug beetles like Polygraphus proximus. This species specialized on the fir, and previously it was not observed within Siberian taiga. And here we see the consequences of these small creatures' impact on the Siberian fir. Fir tried to resist by the resin, but finally die back, and this is stance which affected, killed by that bug beetle. And here that's how say temporal scenes of our famous Stolby National Reserves. And over time, since during last decade, about 70% of the upper canopy were killed by that bug beetle. And then fir growth before mortality was different for cohort which survived, this green one, and which is declined. So bug beetle primarily affected water stressed or weakened trees. But regeneration, this is growth index of regeneration, is healthy. Even that canopy provided say enough say moisture conditions for surviving regeneration. So if there will be no drought extremes, this regeneration will again restore the initial forest. But we are not so optimistic about the future droughts. Then here the illustration of the latest huge outbreak which caused 1 million mortality in these years. This is a map of that outbreak. It moved 50 kilometers northward in comparison of former registered boundaries of outbreak. But potentially now, this Siberian moth can move up to 150, 300 northward to the former pristine taiga forests. Similarly, we made a similar model for the Altai Sayan Mountains. And you see that uphill migration according to potential thermal degradation, which allowed outbreak of Siberian mouse, plus 200 plus 400 meters. And this is the charts which illustrate former data, previous data. This is elevation range of where observed these caterpillars, which may reach 20,000 specimens per one tree. So outbreak range moved uphill and so moved northward. Then conditions which facilitate outbreak of Siberian mouse. First, of course, dry conditions before outbreak, and also drought, extreme drought also promote that. This is the impact of the changes of the topsoil, drought index SPI, and after this begin of outbreak and the end of outbreak. And I almost finished, Mary to hurry. And final notes. Now, along those really dangerous species, we observed just this year an immense outbreak of these species, large tortics and fungi. It is an unprecedented outbreaks in these areas. Large tortics located in this area. In this area, it was last year. Here you see rated as damaged trees. It's just yellow trees. And this is this year, southern area also. And preliminary estimates at about 400,000 hectares. But you know that larch can survive even complete defoliation. But nevertheless, it causes decrease of large increment, of course, and it is decrease of carbon sequestration. And this insect make outbreak in a relatively dry large habitat. What is the matter? Is the last chart? What? Here. But fungi, this mostly occurred on within the rather moisture habitat. Here in the western Sayani Mountains, in southward slopes and also northward slopes, combination of the hot temperature with efficient moisture supply at high elevation. It promotes this huge, we estimate like 50,000 hectares, just preliminary, maybe more, and this is example how large needles become browning, and this outbreak is located at high elevation because more moisture, and also at rather gentle slopes, and also on mostly on southward slopes, and in relatively concave, not deep concave, but relatively concave areas. Here, finally, conclusions. Insect pest outbreaks promotes by air temperature anomalies in combination with drought frequency and severity increase. Stands mortality is caused by the synergy of water stress, that is inside factor, which weakened the trees, and insect outbreaks, which could be considered as contributing factor. And warming caused northward at uphill migration of the Siberian mouse outbreaks range into the former pristine taiga forests. Elevated air temperature provoked immense large tortics outbreak within the relatively dry large habitat, and fungi outbreak with relative moisture large habitat. And finally, within the southern lowlands, observed substitution of precipitation sensitive Siberian pine and fir by tolerant species like betula, Larix sibirica or Pinus sibirica. Thank you, dear colleagues, for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Carrick, for your presentation. That was perfectly timed. So it's come to my attention that we initially had planned the session for 12-minute talks with 5 minutes of questions, but then it got reshuffled such that we now have about 10 minutes for talks and 3 minutes for questions. One of the poster presentations in our session has dropped out, so we will have a 5-minute gap where we can field some more questions as we move forward. So to keep us on schedule, I'm going to introduce our next speaker and propose that we push the questions for Dr. Carrick and Chibakova a little bit down, if that's okay with everyone. Dr. Carrick, could you please stop sharing your screen?
Okay. How to do? How to finish?
So up next, we have Hyunji Kim from Korea University, who will be sharing a poster. It'll be about 3 to 4 minutes, hopefully a minute or so for questions. Hyunji, are you here? I am not seeing Hyunji in the audience right now. So to keep ourselves with the schedule that we have, how about we take the next 3 minutes? And if anyone has questions for Dr. Carrick or Dr. Chibakova, perhaps we could field those at this time.
There was a question for Nadia. Oh, Brendan has his hands up. Go ahead, Brendan. You're muted, Brendan, if you're talking.
Oh, apologies. I was going to say, maybe we should let that first question be asked since it was posed first.
Sure. Okay, so Ursula asked Nadia in the chat, is there a possibility that part of the decline is driven by weakening associations with mycorrhizal associations that negatively affect the dark leaf trees?
Actually, as I was taught in forestry, that the primary factor should be abiotic like climate, and I was concentrated in this specific issue. Does climate influence dieback of dark-leaf conifers? I was answering only this question. If trees are weakened, then we can consider other biotic factors like fungi, like insects, and pathogen, of course.
Thank you.
And then Brendan, if you wanted to ask your question, please go ahead.
Well, it was broader, but it was along the same lines in terms of what might have been causing that mortality. Maybe I can just ask Dr. Karuk then, if there's been any mortality in the stands and regions that you've been studying where you don't know the cause of it. You very, very nicely outlined some of the causes of mortality in those different stands, but have you seen dieback where you just don't know what the cause is from?
You mean there are some biogenic agent which are actually we are working together with our regional station of the forest defense, and they are regularly, not always, but they are looking for the biogenic pathogens. So that are contributing factors in many cases, but not I don't think in all, they are known. So those pathogens, as was said previously, they attack weakened trees. Yeah, I mean the huge mortality, because even in the healthy forest, you will always find some trees which are died and etc. And it is not related with any weather extremes, etc. They may be weakened just by age or something else.
Great, thank you, Dr. Carrick, for that response. So up next, we have a Dr. Greg King from the University of Alberta, who will share a poster on some of his work. Dr. King.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks, or morning where I am, and at least thanks for having me. So this morning I wanted to share a research project that I've been undertaking with Dr. Ryan Danby at Queen's University in conjunction with him, exploring some of the ideas behind forest advance and establishment. And this project that we've been working on is focused on expansion into boreal grasslands, but we really believe that this research also has implications for circumboreal tree line and those projected advances in the coming century of forest into tundra. So the premise behind our research here is that we've used dendrochronology to determine establishment of individuals across 9 different forest grassland ecotone sites in the Kluane region of southern Yukon Territory in Canada. And at the same time as doing that, we also assessed the radial growth of the source populations for this establishment. And the reason we went with radial growth, both using dendrochronology as a dendrochronologist, but that it's often used as a proxy in the literature for biomass increase and thinking about if forests are doing well, then they're going to expand and things like that. So we wanted to look at the links between these two. We compared 2 different species, the 2 dominant species in this region. This is trembling aspen, or Populus tremloides, which is a deciduous and importantly has clonal reproduction tendencies, especially in this area. And we also looked at white spruce, or Picea glauca, which is a seed-bearing conifer. And the important image here is number 2 at the top of the poster. And the key kind of thing to look at for the bins of establishment is those are residuals from a model. We would expect to see more younger individuals. And so we've compared our data of over kind of 900 individuals that we cored and sectioned and things like that to look at this expectation over time that we'd expect to see many younger rather than older individuals. And so we've adjusted for that. And so we made this comparison between our establishments. So we used 5-year bins and also looked at density estimators and things like that, but the results were pretty similar, and compared these with the ring widths of those source populations. The direct comparisons don't reveal much coherency in terms of increased radial growth means increased establishment directly. However, what we did do, if you look at image 3 in the center there, is that we considered possible temporal shifts based on these reproduction strategies of the different species. So for example, with aspen, we noticed that there was slightly positive correlations when we looked at the periods of if we shifted the tree ring growth before and after these establishment pulses that we're calling them. Whereas at the time, direct time of the establishment pulse is actually a slight negative. And when you think about a clonal organism, the potential of supporting new clonal regeneration maybe takes away from potential ring width or energy that's available for radial growth. When you look at the spruce on the right-hand side of that image, we don't really see strong relationships in general, but we see they become more negative over time, meaning that 5 years after establishment, we're actually seeing negative tree ring growth relationships there. The second thing we looked at was comparisons with potential climate drivers for these different processes. And what was revealed is there are no statistically significant connections for establishment in terms of a clear driver of when establishment pulses take place. And what we do see is pretty weak correlations to early growing season precipitation for ring width. This did strengthen when we moved into a positive Pacific decadal oscillation phase. In this region, that's a big driver. And so when you're in a positive phase, it's generally warmer, which means that precipitation would become, it makes sense, it would become a little bit stronger, that signal. And so it's early season precipitation that we see. So, snow depth, so winter precipitation, how much snow there was available, and spring precipitation likely falling either as snow or rain. And so how much moisture is available for those trees to establish. Overall, this research is kind of, we designed it to explore and in the end kind of challenge this idea that it does appear in the literature, that increased radial growth means invariably we're going to see forest advancement. And what we looked at with this great data set, that we can look at the establishment and the source population radial growth right at the same time and link that over a period, is that it's not so clear. I've phrased it very clearly in the poster, but I think it's a more complicated, nuanced picture, and that more things are required for effective establishment than just saying the climate's great for growth, so we're going to have establishment. And I think that's what I'll wrap up today. So thank you very much, and welcome any questions.
Great. Thank you, Dr. King, for the presentation. So I guess we're still trying to stay just on time. I think the shuffling of the time slots left us with a little bit a tighter schedule than anticipated. So we can try to answer some questions down the road, but if we could move on to Dr. Elena Parfanova from the Russian Academy of Sciences, who will share a poster. If we keep around 4 minutes or so, then we could have time for a question with that. If anyone has questions for Dr. King, please put them in the chat. And if you are presenting a poster, especially from a laptop, please zoom in a little bit on your poster so we can see it more clearly.
Dear colleagues, our poster, title of our poster is "Could treeline data reject the idea that predicted warming rises carbon stock in global forests? Supporters of rate of living theory suggest that as an organism reaches its maximal size, so it approaches its life limit. In the last decade, an amount of publications has increased that testified the hypothesis grow fast, die young, based on treeline data usually sampled in extreme alpine habitats of low site index. For instance, Körner, Björn, Veblen, and Bigler, and so on. Conclusions drawn from those studies follow that the carbon sequestration of forests decreases as trees' longevity shortens due to a greater growth rate and faster reaching a maximal size as climate warms. If this theory is correct, then the idea of Kyoto forest makes no sense. We focus on Siberian large forest in the southern Siberian mountains and argue against those conclusions using inventory data published by Anatoly Shvedenko et al. 2008. For Siberian larch, initial rapid height growth shows down after the first 30-50 years and asymptotically approaches height limits characteristic of each site index. The site index curve family, Fig 1, demonstrates how greatly individual tree heights differ depending on site index, bonitet in Russian. While the maximum larch age in Figure 1 is 200 80 years, there is ample historical evidence of Larix sibirica thriving for 500-600 years or longer in productive site index foothills throughout the southern Siberia mountains. You can see here growth trajectories of volume and increment of stands. The hypothesis grow fast die young was inferred from tree-linked data sampled in extreme alpine habitats. Such regression models are reliable and applicable only within the limits in which the models were constructed. The results of this study, therefore, are not sufficient to conclude that the vast global forest stretching across its diverse ecological niches and habitats will have limited capacity to sequester carbon in a warming climate. Thank you for attention.
Thank you, Dr. Parfanova, for your presentation. We will continue on. If you could please stop sharing your screen, that'd be great. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. We will, again, push the questions a little bit. So we have a couple oral presentations coming up. We'll try to keep them to about 10 or 11 minutes to make time for a little bit of questions. So we have Dr. Fleur Nicklin from the National Park Service and the University of Alaska Fairbanks.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, yes.
Oh, great. And can you see my screen?
Indeed.
Oh, wonderful. Let's see, put that in. There we go. Okay. So I have to apologize. I don't have a camera on this computer, so you can't see me. So I'm a botanist with the Central Alaska Inventory and Monitoring Network of the National Park Service and a graduate student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I work with the Vegetation Monitoring Group in the Central Alaska Network, where we monitor plant diversity, composition, structure, and distribution in 3 national parks in interior Alaska. The project I'm going to talk about today, which was recently published in Ecosphere, compares the growth of co-occurring black and white spruce. And we ask if black and white spruce have different growth responses to similar weather conditions, and if their past responses to weather might provide some insight into how the 2 species may respond to climate changes in the future. And we use tree ring data from the Central Alaska monitoring plots to answer these questions. So as our climate warms, there's a much tension focused on how species composition will change with shifting interactions between climate, fire, permafrost, vegetation. Much attention in interior Alaska has been focused on the transition from conifer-dominated to broadleaf-dominated forest as fires become more frequent and severe with climate warming. Less attention has been paid to the more subtle and longer timescale potential shift between white spruce and black spruce. While less dramatic than transition from coniferous to broadleaf. I mean, let's be honest, most people can't even tell the difference between these 2 species. A shift from black to white spruce dominance could reduce the flammability of the landscape, or at least change the fire adaptation of plant cover, increase above ground carbon stores, as white spruce stands in our area tend to have greater basal area than black spruce stands, and increase the forest's susceptibility to bark beetle outbreaks. Black and white spruce geographic distributions largely overlap, suggesting the 2 species have similar climate envelopes, although black spruce extends a little further south on the eastern edge of its distribution. And white spruce extends further south along the Rocky Mountains in the west and north in the Brooks Range. Within their overlapping range in interior Alaska, the two species are highly segregated on the landscape, with black spruce more common on nutrient-poor sites with cold, poorly drained soils, and white spruce more common in well-drained, more nutrient-rich sites and at tree-line sites. You can see the segregation in the background photo too. Black spruce dominates in the area in the middle left where near surface permafrost is present, and white spruce dominates in the lower right near the stream there where soils are warmer and better drained. And as an example of this is a segregation of the nearly 1,300 plots that we have, with at least one spruce species present. Only 316 had both species present. So less than a quarter of our plots with spruce had both present. And it's well documented that the growth response of trees to weather conditions is site dependent. For instance, trees on steep south-facing slopes are more sensitive to drought conditions than trees on mesic sites. So since white and black spruce generally occupy different site conditions on the landscape, it's hard to compare the climate growth responses of these two species. So for accurate comparison, you need to compare trees that are growing in the same site conditions. And that's what we did in this study. So we had a very simple objective of directly comparing the radial growth responses of co-occurring black and white spruce trees to weather conditions. And we also sought to understand the role that thaw depth of the active layer may play in these two species' responses to weather conditions, as thaw depth is an important factor in delineating the occurrence of these two species across the landscape, and it's actively changing, deepening as our climate warms. And I'll note that in interior Alaska, black spruce is much more common in areas with shallow thaw, and white spruce is more common in areas with deep thaw, but both species attain their highest biomass in areas where white spruce is most common. And we interpret this as competitive exclusion of black spruce by white spruce in these more productive areas. Okay, so to directly compare these two species, we selected all the plots from our network of randomly established monitoring plots where both species had been cored, and these are shown as pink plus marks in this map. We bolstered our random sample with some supplemental plots along the Yukon River, shown in blue circles. In this map, you can also see the plots where only one spruce species was cored, pink circles for black spruce and green circles for white spruce, and these were not used in this analysis. We had a total of 310 black spruce, 318 white spruce, and I'll breeze over this table, but just pause to point out that the mean age of the trees, the two species in our sample was similar, and that white spruce was on average larger and had larger growth rings than black spruce in both plots with shallow thaw depth and deep thaw depth. And I used the mean thaw depth of 57 centimeters as that split between shallow and deep. We compared the climate growth responses of the two species in several different ways. A paired t-test of climate growth correlations at the plot level, a linear mixed effects model of basal area increment at the tree level, and a comparison of growth over time at the study area level. Since our study design involved paired black and white spruce trees at each plot, our data were suited for a simple two-tailed paired t-test to assess whether two species show different climate growth correlations. The climate growth correlation coefficients for the two species were very similar. You can see the dots showing the correlation coefficients, orange for black spruce and blue for white spruce, almost all overlap. The climate variables used, downscaled historical climate data, are shown on the x-axis. And overall, radial growth for both species was negatively correlated with mean previous June, July, and August temperatures and current May temperatures, and positively correlated with precipitation in August of the previous year. The only difference that's clearly detected by the paired t-test was that black spruce showed a more positive response to previous year June, July precipitation sums than white spruce. And these graphs show the basal area increment response to climate variables estimated by the mixed effects model. Black spruce, again, is shown in orange and white spruce in blue. Climate variables are shown on the x-axis. Similarly to the paired t-test, the results of the linear mixed effects model show that the largest difference in climate growth response between the two species was Black spruce's greater positive response to June-July precipitation as compared to white spruce. The mixed effects model also showed that Black spruce had a more negative response to mean August temperatures than white spruce. The two species across thaw depth conditions showed only small differences in the response to mean May temperatures and mean June-July temperature. The difference in the two species' response to June-July temperature only became obvious when we considered the influence of thaw depth. So our most striking finding was that thaw depth mediated species climate growth responses, especially the response of white spruce. In these contour plots, the x-axis is mean June-July temperature, and the y-axis is mean June-July precipitation. And the contours are cumulative 2-year basal area increment growth, with light yellow showing higher growth and red less growth. On deeper thaw depths, white spruce had an overall positive response to June-July temperatures. But in areas with shallow thaw depths, the opposite pattern was observed. Growth decreased with increasing June-July temperature. Black spruce, on the other hand, Black spruce radial growth was less modified by thaw depth than white spruce. In both deeply thawed plots and plots with shallow thaw depths, Black spruce showed positive growth response to high June-July precipitation and only a modest boost in growth with June-July temperatures on deep thaw depth, with an optimum mean June-July temperature for growth shifting from less than 10 degrees on shallow thaw depths to about 14 degrees on deeply thawed areas.
1 minute countdown.
Okay, so this is just a look at growth over time of the two species. And to examine growth over time, it used a 4-curve regional detrended chronology. There's a lot to consider here, but I'll just point out that the annual fluctuations and long-term trends were very similar between species, but that thaw depth, which is the dotted versus solid lines here, had a greater effect on species than the chronology patterns. And after about 1980, Black spruce had greater ring width index than white spruce. I'll skip to the conclusions. So thaw depth played a pivotal role in the two species climate growth responses, which points to a primary mechanism behind the differences in the distribution of the two species across the landscape in interior Alaska, and implies that widespread thawing of permafrost may foster some expansion of white spruce in this region at the expense of Black spruce. And so we also saw that Black spruce had a more positive radial growth response to increased summer precipitation than white spruce, and white spruce was more sensitive to warmer June-July temperatures, which suggests changes in precipitation patterns will exert important influences on the relative growth rates of these two species. And in some landscape positions, Black spruce may gain competitive advantage over white spruce in a wetter climate. Thank you. And this is the reference for the paper I was talking about.
Great, thank you very much, Fleur. That was an excellent presentation. We may have time for one quick question as Joanne White from the Canadian Forest Service gets ready for hers. Dr. Vashlev, sure. Sorry, because that wasn't a question. That was a clap.
Oh.
Let's.
I had a question if there's time.
Perhaps quickly.
Oh, okay. Well, I was just going to ask if maybe you can answer in the chat if there's no time, but if you considered looking also at some kind of drought index, or do you think it would just kind of tell the same exact story?
No, I think it would be good to look at a drought index. I did look at vapor pressure deficit, and that actually was a little bit better explanatory, better explanatory power than temperature. So I think a drought index might actually be even better.
Awesome.
Great, thank you. So up next, we have Dr. Joanne White from the Canadian Forest Service for a oral presentation.
Great. Can you see my screen okay?
It just currently looks black. It says you're
Okay.
starting to share the screen, but it's not showing.
Okay, I'll try again here.
Yes, it's not coming up that time either. It says double click to enter full screen mode, but I'm not sure if that would make a difference. Are you in sharing your screen, it sometimes gives you the option to share a specific window within your computer. Is it perhaps on a different one?
Let's try this.
There we go. You see that.
Okay. Sorry about that. Good morning. Thank you. I am a research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service based out of Victoria on the West Coast. I just want to acknowledge my co-authors on this work. So just consider some of the reasons why we might want to monitor forest recovery. I guess to better characterize forest dynamics, we must be able to capture both disturbance and recovery processes on the landscape. Forest recovery is a key component of sustainable forest management and climate change mitigation. And investments in forest regeneration and restoration need to be guided by baseline data on the potential for natural regeneration at a given location. So the most challenging aspect, though, of working on forest recovery is explicitly defining what we mean by forest recovery. A stand replacing disturbance is often discrete in both time and space, but forest recovery following disturbance is a long-term process with the structure, composition, and function of forests returning gradually over time. So that point in time in which we consider the forest to be recovered depends very much on our definition and on our information need. For example, for reclamation purposes, we may consider recovery to be defined by the return of herbaceous vegetation to a site, whereas a silvicultural definition may require trees to meet certain size and density requirements. So what are some scenarios of forest recovery that we expect? Well, the first being no recovery, implying there's been some kind of land use change that's happened. A facilitated recovery, which is often associated with intensive forest management. And then more commonly, natural recovery, characterized by successional processes and dictated largely by pre-disturbance forest composition and structure, the nature and severity of the disturbance, biological legacies, and climate and local site conditions. So why would we consider remote sensing for this application? Well, globally, satellite time series data are increasingly available. They provide synoptic coverage, they're spatially explicit, and many are open access. You know, current methods of assessing recovery are often sample-based and rely on ground measurements or on subjective assessments. And they focus largely on harvested areas. Most jurisdictions in Canada have their own standards and protocols for assessing forest regeneration, and those differ across the country. In terms of retrospective capacity, data from the Landsat series of satellites, for example, have been acquiring data at 30-meter resolution since 1984. So they give us capacity to establish baselines of recovery and expectations in different regions of the country. And these data can readily integrate with other data sources to give us a monitoring framework. When we started working on this topic several years ago, we did a synthesis of plot measurements from the literature. We wanted a sense of expectation. How long does it take for stands that are impacted by wildfire and harvesting to recover to benchmarks of canopy cover greater than 10% and height greater than 5 meters? Both of these relate to the FAO definitions of forest and also basal area. And we found that generally it takes 5 to 10 years post-disturbance to achieve these benchmarks of cover, but there is a large amount of variability. Depends a great deal on site factors, and basal area, of course, takes longer to achieve. So the data we use for our recovery analysis are Landsat best available pixel composites developed through our composite to change approach. Their methods are described in these references. Critically, these data are annual wall-to-wall surface reflected reflectance composites. So they're not just beautiful images, but real physical values that we can use in our analysis. So from these annual composites, we have identified changes and attributed them to a causal agent. For our recovery work, we focused on areas impacted by stand replacing wildfires and harvest. In previous work, we examined national trends in disturbance and recovery over a 25-year period from 1985 to 2010. In our recent work, we've updated the time series to 2017. We focused on validating measures of spectral recovery using airborne LiDAR data, and we've identified spatial hotspots of recovery or spatial clusters with longer than expected recovery times on the landscape. So just stepping back a bit for a moment, so how do we measure recovery using remotely sensed data? Well, the detectability of forest disturbance and subsequent recovery is enabled by changes in the presence, composition, and structure of vegetation, which in turn all influence the spectral reflectance properties. We use vegetation indices that are often designed to take advantage of the different spectral responses in vegetation and exposed soil at different wavelengths. So we use the normalized burn ratio, which measures differences in vegetation response in the near infrared and shortwave infrared wavelengths. As our definition of recovery includes the return of trees to a site, we use a long-term metric of spectral recovery called the years to recover, or Y2R. This tells us the number of years required for a pixel to attain 80% of its pre-disturbance NBR values. So here you have the disturbance and the recovery trajectory following that disturbance. And this particular metric has been used in a number of different forest types. So looking at some results, we see that Y2R varies by disturbance type. So 89% of areas in Canada's forests that were disturbed by harvest and 67% of areas disturbed by wildfire had spectrally recovered by the end of the time series in 2017. Does this mean that the remaining areas will never recover? No, of course not. It means that they have not spectrally recovered yet. And indeed, if we look at disturbances, just disturbances that occurred prior to 1990, we start to see a convergence between harvest and wildfire areas. So we do know that wildfire areas take longer on average to recover than harvest areas, with harvest areas having a Y2R of about 6 years compared to wildfire at 11 years. Because these data are spatially explicit, we can look at rates by meaningful ecological units. Here we've used ecozones, and we can do the same for harvest, and we can see how those vary. But we could do this for any meaningful spatial unit. A key benefit of having spatially explicit data is that we can generate maps. So here's an example from the Boreal Plains ecozone in Alberta. On the far left, we have a 2017 BAP composite, so Landsat image from the end of our time series. In the middle, we have the Y2R values plotted by 5-year epoch. And on the right, we have significant positive spatial clusters, so areas of slower recovery than expectation shown in red. So to validate this Y2R metric, we used airborne LiDAR data, which were available in the areas in green shown on this map, so different forest regions across the country. We sampled actually more than 500,000 pixels, approximately equally distributed between harvest and wildfire areas. A key constraint was that the LiDAR data had to be acquired within plus or minus 2 years of when we considered the pixel to be spectrally recovered. What we found was that 85% of pixels that we considered to be spectrally recovered for harvest and 96% of wildfire pixels had achieved benchmarks of height and or cover. And in this figure here, you see the red indicates the pixels that had not achieved those benchmarks. So how does this compare? Well, we can compare this to a study we did in the boreal forests of southern Finland, where we looked at harvest areas only, but using similar data and approach. And there we found that 96% of pixels had achieved the targets for cover and height. Importantly, we can use these Y2R values to establish national or regional baselines by disturbance type. So the example here provides a broad scale indication of recovery performance for ecozones relative to that national baseline. We can do the same thing regionally. And then, as I mentioned, we can also use these baseline information and spatial statistical analysis to come up with hotspots of spectral recovery. And what we found in our analysis so far is that nationally, there's about 3.2% of areas of disturbed areas from harvesting and about 3.9% of areas disturbed by wildfire that have slower than expected recovery on the landscape. And this just gives you an example of what these hotspots would look like and the interpretation of the Y2R values. So in terms of opportunities for monitoring forest recovery over large areas, some key takeaways, I guess. Definitions of recovery must be clear and measurable. And as I've indicated, we've used the FAO definitions of forest in our analysis, but of course, other interpretations are possible. A disturbance type is critical for understanding post-disturbance recovery. Airborne LiDAR provide a means to relate that spectral recovery to the return of a forest structure and improve our understanding of what the spectral information is telling us. Spatial statistics provide a useful tool to enable us to identify hotspots of spectral recovery on the landscape. And spectral and structural recovery within 10 years post-disturbance are highly variable and are influenced by both composition and residual structures on the landscape. We have to interpret these results within the context of time since disturbance, among other factors. But I think the spectral recovery metrics give us a spatially explicit and temporally exhaustive tool that can help us augment ground-based assessments. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. White, for the fantastic presentation. So we have a poster presentation coming up by Dr. Pavel Frolov, excuse me, from the Russian Academy of Sciences. And then we'll have a 5-minute open slot where we can bring up some questions that might have been lingering that we can address. Dr. Frolov.
Yes.
Hi, feel free to share your screen and start your presentation.
Yes. Yes. Dear colleagues, I would like to present you a talk on prediction biomass of Vaccinium myrtillus using random distribution and root-to-shoot ratio models. Investigation of relationships between biomass of different plant compartments is important because there vary in turnover between biomass of different plant compartments. Is important because their vary in turnover rates affect the amount and composition of above ground and below ground litter, which has a direct effect on nutrient cycling and carbon accumulation in soil. A study of biomass partitioning among compartments of the bilberry Vaccinium myrtillus, a common clone dwarf shrub in boreal coniferous forest, was carried out at 11 study sites in Finland. The hypothesis that the biomass partitioning of bilberry follows a common pattern across a variety of pedatic conditions in a geographic range, and its pattern can be modeled by the rank distribution of compartment biomasses. We found that the highest portion of total biomass belonged to rhizomes, which were followed by root stems, roots, and leaves. Some of this pattern was observed regardless of latitude zone, northern and southern Finland, site fertility level measured as soil carbon nitrogen ratio, and canopy dominant tree species, pine or spruce. The observed ratios between biomass compartments varied between different sites. In particular, we found that the exact ratio between above and below ground biomass was dependent on the carbon-nitrogen ratio of the soil organic matter. Exponential model with R squared 0.443, showing that bilberry allocates more biomass to below ground parts in the nutrient poor than in the nutrient rich sites. The results suggested that there are uniform regulatories in the structural organization within the plant species representing clonal growth form of dwarf shrubs. This observation enables us to use the rank distribution of compartments in modeling biomass partitioning of bilberry in a wide range on environmental conditions. Also, the mechanisms underlying such regulatories require using the situation. Our model showed generally good fit to the independent experimental data, sampling in different region and type of forest, as well as by different methods. The model predicted the portion of rhizomes very well, and those of stems and leaves were predicted moderately well. The maximum delay of bears was addressed to the portion of fine roots, which seems to be overestimated by the model. However, more reasonable explanation could be related to the possible losses of some fine roots during excavation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Frolov. That's great to see some work on understory plants as well. So we have a couple minutes now. We have about 5 minutes that we can use to address any questions that folks might have in relation to the last handful of presentations. If anyone would like to ask a question, please put it in the chat box or feel free to raise your hand, and Adrianna will field those questions.
Brendan, go ahead.
All right, thanks. So I was curious, it's a question for Joanne White, and I was just curious if you could comment on the faster recovery for harvest sites compared to fire sites and what might be the main drivers of that.
Sure. So I think we have to remember that wildfire will affect all sites regardless of site quality, whereas we tend to harvest on high quality sites. And so I think site potential definitely influences what we're seeing. We also have a situation where in some parts of the country we have facilitated recovery as opposed to just natural regeneration. So I think that also influences what we're seeing in those results. So I think it's primarily a function of site and intervention.
I'm sorry, I have some problems with sound. Can you repeat, please?
Hi. Oh, I believe that prior question was for Joanne White, but we can hear you okay.
I have some problems with sound.
Slava had also asked in the chat if fire would promote white spruce northern migration, which I think is a great question. I don't know if anyone wants to answer that. I think it was directed towards perhaps Greg or Fleur, but yeah.
Yeah, Andy Lloyd has two really nice papers that look at that question from 2005 and 2007. So those are probably the best references, but it's more like moderate fire promotes potentially black spruce migration and white spruce fire. I don't think her papers indicate that helps northern migration of white spruce. There's also a substrate, like a pH limiting factor too, I think, with white spruce growing better on higher pH. Yeah, I would just point to those two references.
Great, well, thank you. So let's use this opportunity to move on to our next oral presentation, which will be by Dr. Arden Burrell from the Woodwell Climate Research Center. Arden, feel free to take it away.
Yep, give me 1 second. So because it's like 2:30 in the morning here, I've pre-recorded this and then I'll answer any questions at the end. So let me know if the audio doesn't work. Hi, my name's Arden Burrell. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Woodwell Climate Research Center, and my talk today is on the predictability of near-term changes in forest biomass, a case study in boreal North America. So a little bit of background. Over the boreal zone, climate change is driving both an increase in mortality events, but also a broad increase in biomass. In 2018, Rogers et al. Put out a paper that showed that early signs of mortality events could be detected in the remote sensing record up to 15 years in advance of the event itself. Using that information, the goal of our current research is to create a near-term, up to about 30-year forecast for biomass change using machine learning. Now, the 30-year window is important because many other modeling frameworks really struggle in that kind of 5 to 30-year time period, but it's also the time period over which management decisions are made. The overall kind of logic of our research is to take site level observations, climate, and remotely sensed vegetation data available at a time, we're going to call it T0, and then predict change in the biomass for a future time here labeled Tn. To do that, we first built up a database of sites. Now, these sites are characterized by the fact that they have repeat measurements. They're permanent sample plots. And we were able to collect about 20,000 permanent sample plots from 13 different agencies across Canada and Alaska. For each of these sites, we then built a database of 2,000 predictor variables that we could use for modeling. These variables included long-term satellite vegetation indexes, soil characteristics, climate variables, species data, as well as site-level measurements of stem density and biomass. This figure shows the number of observations in our database per year. While we have some sites that were sampled before 1940, our modeling approach relies on remotely sensed data, which means that we're only able to include sites after the start of the modern satellite era in 1982. This figure shows the spatial distribution of the sites that we included in our modeling. You can see some really interesting patterns. So there is some very enthusiastic sampling over Nova Scotia and Eastern Canada, but through Central and Western Canada, the number of sites and the number of sites decreases and the number of gaps increases significantly. This figure shows a probability density function of the gaps between observations at a site level, again grouped by those we couldn't include in the model and those we could model. This is included to show that there is a very interesting sampling practice where many regions sample on a 5-year time schedule, and that is apparent in these regular bumps. We also see that in terms of model sites, the number of sites with greater than 30 years gaps is very small. For our machine learning method, we employed extreme gradient boosted regression modeling. I'm not going to go into the full detail of the withholding procedure, but the short version is that 5% of the data was fully withheld, and then the remaining data was split using a 10-fold grouped k-fold to create a 10-member model ensemble. It also should be clear that our modeling approach is not trying to predict disturbance events. Sites where disturbance was recorded between T0 and Tn were excluded from the model, but it should be noted that disturbance data quality varies considerably by region and through time, and so it's highly likely that some sites that we've modeled were disturbed. So the first step of our modeling procedure was feature selection. A model with 2,000 predictor variables is, one, computationally incredibly expensive, and two, is not very portable. You can't share it with someone else. It's too much data. Our data set also has the problem in that many of our variables, our predictor variables, are highly correlated with each other. This figure on the right shows a correlation matrix between all 2,000 predictor variables, with 1 being perfectly positive correlation and -1 being perfect negative correlation. As you can see, there are very large correlation patterns within this data set. This also has a bit of a problem. 2,000 features is too many for most exhaustive feature selection methods like recursive feature elimination with cross-validation. But the high degree of correlation also makes other feature selection methods that use feature importance impossible. And so we had to develop a slightly more complicated feature selection method. To perform feature selection, we first applied a hierarchical clustering that groups features based on their correlation to each other. We then selected the best feature from each group, which allowed us to rapidly reduce the number of features whilst still retaining most of the information. This allowed us to reduce it from 2,000 to about 100 to 120 features. After that, we applied recursive feature elimination through cross-validation to further reduce the number of variables, usually between 40 and 70 variables in the final model without any loss in model performance. We then finally applied Bayesian hyperparameter optimization to select the model features. Overall, this gave us a model ensemble with a mean out of sample R² of greater than 0.6. As you can see in this grouped heat map, the highest density of observations fall on the 1-to-1 line. This version of the heat map shows the same information, but now it's been normalized so that each column sums to 1. I've included it here to highlight how performance when predicting increases is excellent, but decreases shows a positive bias that we will talk about more in the following slides. The reason for the excellent model performance while predicting increases can be seen in the most important features. Ecosystems follow predictable growth curves. The model is able to capture this curve using the biomass at t = 0 and the gap between the observations, shown here in red, along with species data, shown here in orange, and climate data, shown here in blue. It's for this reason the model can robustly predict up to 30 years in advance. I will note here in this figure that you can also still see the 5-year sampling interval very obviously. When we split the figure by the observed change direction, we see that loss residuals are larger, diverge from the zero line much faster, and show a strong positive bias. This bias is also replicated when we look at the residuals by region. Areas with positive increases, shown in blue, are fairly symmetrical around zero in all regions, whilst loss show a positive bias in all regions. So when it comes to predicting biomass loss, we find that our model ensemble underestimates loss, and it also can't predict losses far into future. But there is a big but. Now, if we look at the 5% of data that is fully withheld in all models and start looking at ensemble statistics, what we find is that as the number of models that predict loss increases, the likelihood of loss also increases. And this means that when predicting future changes, while we aren't able to capture the magnitude, in areas where we have model agreement about loss, it is likely that loss will occur. This figure shows our predictions for this year aggregated into a 1/2 degree grid, where 1 indicates all sites predicting increases and -1 indicating all sites within a grid cell predicting decreases. And we see large increases predicted for the eastern half of Canada, with a more mixed response in the western portion. This pattern continues through 2025, all the way through to 2040. So in summary, we have an excellent model that can predict increases in biomass 30 years into the future with acceptable accuracy. The models are better at predicting increases than decreases, but model ensembles can detect biomass loss, but tend to underestimate the magnitude. And there is a great need for more repeat measurement sites so that this model development can continue. And finally, future work is to develop a gridded product and ultimately tools for managers. Questions?
Great, thank you, Art. Well timed. So it looks like we have 2 minutes available for questions, if anyone has any. Like I said, I have a question. Do you see much of a difference in the ability of models to predict changes in biomass depending on kind of the dominant species groups, or does the model hold pretty well across different forest types?
It's pretty robust across different forest types. The performance was fairly similar. It does have all that species data as input variables, and those variables were retained through feature selection. So it is using that information in its predictions. So yeah, the performance is fairly consistent across the different forest types.
Great, thank you. Exciting work. So we, up next, have Dr. Alexei Trubin from the Czech University of Life Sciences to give a talk. Dr. Trubin, feel free to take it away.
I don't see them in the chat, but perhaps if you're here, speak up.
There's an Alexei Trubin in the main room.
Oh,
I will
maybe
request that
we
they join
can,
this room.
yeah, maybe we can move on and come back to Alexei.
That sounds good. Dr. Ryan Danby, does that sound good with you to go now? Excellent. So then in that case,
I can do that.
We have Dr. Ryan Danby from Queen's University as our next speaker.
Just going to pull up my presentation here. Everybody see that okay?
Not yet, but it seems like it's maybe thinking about it.
Oh, okay. Sharing is paused. Bring your shared window to the front, it's telling me here.
Okay. Yeah, we just see
Let
it
me
black.
just try this.
We can see that window, but not when you try zooming in.
Not when I go full screen, eh?
Correct.
Weird.
It's black. Yep.
Okay, just give me a sec here. Sorry about this, folks. That'll be if I go into PowerPoint.
There we go. That looks good.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. So the title of the poster here is Stand Dynamics of Forest Patches at Latitudinal Tree Line. And my co-author, Greg King, we heard from earlier. Just a bit of background. And I'll just pull up my laser pointer here. Latitudinal tree line represents the northern limits of the boreal forest and is expected to advance with continued climate warming. But it's not an abrupt boundary. And instead, it's actually a constellation or a patchwork of forest patches that decrease in size and stature with increasing latitude. And the objective of our study here was to assess population dynamics of trees within these patches in a remote area of Canada's Northwest Territories, indicated on this map here. To do this, we used tree ring analysis to determine the year of establishment of black spruce in 8 discrete forest patches that spanned the entire length of the ecotone. And there's a map here illustrating the distribution of those sites in Central Northwest Territories. And at each patch, we sampled over 40 trees across the breadth of the patch and through the middle of the patch. So edge to edge and through the middle of the patch. And we developed age distributions of these trees and compared them to theorized responses that we might potentially see. And we identified 4 of these, one being an expansion of a patch, so an enlargement of a patch over time. The second being an emerging of 2 or more patches, emerging together of those. The third being an infilling or an increase of stem density within a patch. So not a change in area, but a change in stem density. And the fourth being no change at all, where a change is a patch is static in terms of its tree population dynamics. So what did we find? Well, in terms of age, and I'll draw your attention to this series of graphs here, which present the age distributions of trees in each of these 8 different patches. We found that the year of establishment in total ranged from 1767 to the youngest being 1992. And all of these 8 patches existed well before the year 1900. In terms of our theorized responses, we found evidence that all 4 of these theoretical responses existed. But more commonly, there was sort of hybridized or combined responses where we had a patch that might exhibit infilling, but also an expansion, for instance. And while some patches did exhibit a heightened response or a heightened establishment of black spruce over the last 100 years, there's nothing in the data that indicates a rapid or advance of tree line since the year 1900. And that contrasts with results from Yukon and Alaska, which are mostly comprised of white spruce tree lines, where the studies have been done, where changes have been actually quite substantial. So you might say that the overarching message here is one of variability, both within a patch, between patches, and indeed between study regions at latitudinal and at latitudinal tree lines across Western North America. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Danby. It looks like we have time for one quick question. Is that work that you guys have published, or is it still underway?
Still underway. Yeah, we're trying to right now we're working on complementary ring width analysis of these trees. So we've got the basic message in terms of population dynamics, but we want to compare that with growth analysis, and we're just working through that right now.
Awesome. I look forward to seeing that. Well, then let's move on to our next speaker. We have Dr. Alexei Trubin from the Czech University of Life Sciences. Dr. Trubin, is it a good time?
Yeah, thank you. I'm not doctor, but still, thank you so much. So I hope you hear me well. So I think I can start my presentation if you don't mind. So sharing my screen now. And yes. You see it well? Yes. So hello, dear colleagues and dear participants of the conference. So my name is Alexei Trubin. I'm second year PhD student in Czech University of Life Science in Prague. So, and my topic is northernmost European spruce bar beetle Ipsipographus outbreak, modeling tree mortality using remote sensing and climate data. So nowadays, you can see that the role of European spruce bar beetle Ipsipographus in Eurasia is one of the most economically important forest pests, and also it causes severe damage to coniferous forest in the northern hemisphere. But regardless, its natural habitat of European forest ecosystems, despite their essential role in forest regeneration, we see that the outbreaks of the natural disturbance agents such as bar beetles have significantly exceeded frequencies and impacts. So forests worldwide are becoming increasingly vulnerable to dieback caused by heat and drought-induced physiological stress, which is often associated with the enhanced development of the forest insect pest species. So, and the combination of frequent droughts and the high temperatures is considered to be an important factor for the bar beetle outbreaks, directly affecting insect population dynamics and indirectly through alteration in growth and defense of host plant. So go into the map, you see yellow mapped borders of Arkhangelsk region. And as you can see with the numbers, so half of this is the forest land, and 50 on 50, the commercial forest is covered with softwooded broadleaves and conifers. So let me explain the Arkhangelsk region case. And this is the European part of Russia, the zone of periodic epidemics of Ipsipographus and associated decay of spruce. And the mass forest dieback in Arkhangelsk region was observed since 1997. And from 2004 till the end of 2005, the area of tree mortality has increased about 50%. So, and now it's estimated today at more than 2 million hectares. In 2014, about 5% of forest land has been damaged. So going closer to the area of our interest, it's called the Dwinsko-Pinishsky forest area, and this area is about 1.045 million hectares. These pictures, you can see the result of the bar beetle outbreak, and in this natural and non-managed zone. And aviation forest health monitorings clearly indicate the forest dieback and tree mortality in this area. So this case description is that this spruce stands of this area is mostly high age and one dominant generation. Most of them have a post-fire origin, and truly say this is highly preserved taiga areas without traces of anthropogenic impacts. The trigger of this situation could be called a system of felling with the formation of huge forest edges, lack of clearing at felling sites, partial cutting systems, environmental pollution, as the last factor is climate change, as complex combination of heat and moisture supply may act as a stress. So our main hypothesis was which combinations of predictive variables such as temperature, precipitation, and previous year's damage are suited as predictors for annual tree cover loss. Going to map overview, you can see that the area of interest is Dvinska-Pinersky Reserve. It's part of the area, and now it's established. This reserve is established, and the area is 300,042 hectares, and the dominant forest forming species is the Siberian spruce. It's almost 85 of the forest area. So going to the calculation, we used the annual tree cover loss maps from 2003 till 2015 from Hansen, based on time series analysis of Landsat images to create annual maps at 30 and 30 pixel spatial resolution. So the maps are the set of vectorized data from the original 10 degree granules raster layer cut by the polygon of the reserve's boundaries. So the vectorization was performed in QGIS environment using GDIL polygonized utility plugin, and the area of the polygons for each year was calculated with the field calculator. So here you can see the result of the processing of this is the vector layer with the particular tree cover loss for each year. But this on this layer you can see all the combined layers. So going to the graph section. So here you can see annual tree cover loss of Siberian spruce caused by stipographers by years of observation. On this slide, you can see climatic variables which we defined for this study and the meteorological variables which are with the description. So as you can see, this mostly things connected with the temperature, precipitation, and monthly total duration of the sunshine. So go into the model section. On this slide, we can see the potential models are demonstrated on the right side of the screen. We defined 17 models, and we detected them with LM function relation with the future assessment of AICC tests and different competing models based on various combination of main predictor variables will be ranked by this. So all of the calculations were in RStudio, and you can see on the right side the list of the models. Going to the section with the best models is selected, so we can see that this model is based on June temperature and average temperature in the previous year. So this is two predictor best model visualization of LM function on the right side, and the period which we observed these relations was 14 years. So going to the tree cover loss change and our temperatures graph, you can see that in the previous year and tree cover loss change, the trend lines time series looks very of this time series looks very similar, and the trend lines are kind of almost showing that they look very same. And going to summary and conclusions of our research. So our results show that the tree mortality caused by the bark beetle outbreak in Arkhangelsk region was related mainly to temperature in current and previous years. Other factors like June precipitation and April and May duration of the sunshine, we found that also important and used in the modeling, and they are in the list of the best models. The bark beetle outbreak in the study areas was probably influenced by two groups of factors, as we consider. The first group is related to increasing temperature sums and connected increase of aggressiveness of bark beetle population, and while the second group relates to drought and connected decrease of spruce defense abilities. So as we can say that we don't fully understand the Stylographus flight behavior. So, and we need more research and further studies for this in this area. So I think I can finish, and let me say thank you so much for the attention. Maybe you have some kind of questions. I will be happy to answer.
Thank you, Alexei. We have time for a question.
Good.
Looks like there's a question from Clement Hardy. Go ahead.
Yes, if it's all right. Thank you for your presentation, Alexei. I was just curious to know if you'd have maybe some insights or some information about how predators to the bark beetle might have a change in demographics, like their parasitoids or maybe the birds that eat them. Do they increase in population, seeing that there seem to be a lot of increases in the bark beetle in your area?
Easily say that we, so I'm firstly to say that I'm from this area. I was born there and lived for 25 years. And I can say that nowadays we can see that the beetles we can see bark beetles more often in the more northern parts of our region. So basically nearby the Arctic Circle. So connected, and things which can be connected is we can see that they are moving north, but the amount of the outbreaks and the area of the outbreaks, I think so, I cannot say that they are increasing much. So this case is kind of special one, because this is kind of intact forest area, intact forest landscapes. They are they were not managed by human, I think, for 200 years, and this is an area of really unique forest. But in managed area, I think things are working not so fast like it was there. For, as you can see, that 2 million hectares was destroyed by in 10 years by the bark beetle. So it means like nothing in climate or from human side affected by this affected this process. So I think it could be different on different conditions of conditions of the forest types or regime of using the forests. But the bark beetles going north, it's clear.
Thank you.
Great, well, thank you for that. So we have one final presentation in our session today, and that is by Dr. Jiang Wu from the Natural Resources Institute of Finland. Dongjia, are you here?
I see them in the participants, but you're muted if you're, there we go.
There we go. Great. Would you mind zooming in a little bit on your presentation?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Welcome.
Oh, okay, finally it's me. Wait. Oh. Hello everyone. I'm Dong Xiaowu. I come from China. Now I'm external researcher in Nature Resources Institute, Finland. The aim of this study to determine whether the pollination site affects the frost hardening of scorespan progenies. In Finland, for the production of the high-quality seeds for forest regeneration, seed arch has of the grafted plus tree of scorespan have been established in different locations. In those arches, surrounding pollination may reduce the genetic quality of seeds. In order to avoid that effect, finished plus tree seeds arches also established in Ukraine, where the area has no surrounding pollination effects. However, there are no comparative studies on the effects of surrounding pollination of frost hardening of scorespan progenies of the in the different located seed arches.
Dongjian, sorry to interrupt you. We can't see your poster.
Ah, I think it shows here. No? Can you see it?
You're not sharing your screen right now.
Oh, I'm sorry. I shared my screen, but it's maybe not showing.
There we go. We can see it now. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Yeah.
There we go. Great. Yeah. If you explain a little bit.
Okay, then I will continue. Yeah, we use the first year seedlings scorespan of different progenies. The seeds were collected from the plus tree seeds arch in both in Finland and Ukraine, and also the nature stands in Finland as the control samplings. The frost hardening of the seedlings was assessed twice during the cold acclimation in controlled conditions with freezing tests by 4 different methods. The first figure shows the result, the frost hardening of needles, which were varied from -40 to -80. It's there's some difference also among the different progenies. And the second figure is an example shows clear thresholds from the decreases or the death in shoot growth, where between -8 and -16. The third figure shows a summary of the frost hardening by different methods. From this study, we found some frost hardening differences in the needles, but not in the roots and the root regrowth. From the whole plant angles, we conclude that both of the seed arches are suitable for the seeds production to use in finished conditions. That's all. Thank you so much for listening. And questions, please.
Thank you very much. So we have about 5 minutes